Hello and welcome from the University of Georgia Office of Research. Today is Tuesday, May 4th, 2021, and thank you for joining us for this session of Research Matters Live. This is the final installment of a 5-part series on community-based participatory research, and today we're going to talk about consent. My name is Mike Terezis, and I'm the Director of Research Communications here at UGA. We look forward to providing you some useful information and answering your questions as best we can. Before we get started, let me just mention a couple housekeeping points. We'll wait until the end of the presentation to ask questions, and you can ask them however you like, through the chat, through the Q&A, or through the raise hand function. You should see all those options along the bottom of your Zoom window. If you raise your hand, we'll assume you want to ask your question by voice, and I'll call on you by name and enable your microphone while you ask your question. So we'd like to hear any feedback you have about today's session, including suggestions for future topics. Just go to the Research Matters Live webpage and you'll see that URL pop up in the chat here in just a minute. There's a suggestion form button at the top of the page. Please make use of it. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. Let me introduce our speakers today. We've got Kim Fowler, who is Director of the Human Subjects Office in the Office of Research. Nathan Hansen, Professor and Department Head of Health Promotion and Behavior in the College of Public Health. Nan McMurray, Director of Collection Development in the UGA Libraries and an IRB member. Lisa Renzi Hammond, Associate Professor in the College of Public Health and Vice Chair of UGA's Clinical and Biomedical IRB. And Miranda Hill, a social behavioral scientist and postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. Her research explores HIV inequities among cisgender and transgender feminine people living with HIV. She received both her MPH and her PhD in health promotion and behavior from UGA. Kim, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Mike. I will announce to everyone that Tucker Hall, which is where Mike and I are today, is having a little bit of difficulty with our internet. So we apologize for signal disruptions should they occur. I want to say thank you to everyone here today. This is the last of a series of 5. It's been a labor of love over the spring semester. And I really think that we have put together some really great conversation starters. And we hope that everyone visits the Research Matters Live website, looks at our recordings, and we're going to find another place for these things to live as well so that others can enjoy these moving forward. So I'm going to get us started very briefly today, kind of where we started the entire series, which is talking about the Human Research Protection Program and why we're doing this. We have an obligation to provide education to our community about research, how to do research, not just how to get an IRB project approved, but to actually conduct the study in a way that's not just compliant, but ethical. And so this is part of our education and outreach that we would normally do as an accredited human research protection program. We also have a responsibility to make sure that UGA is promoting the involvement of the community in the design and conduct of research and giving results to our community in a way that they can use them. And there's no better way to do that than community-based participatory research. So that has been why we have come at all of these different topics through that lens of community engagement. And that's really all I'm going to say to get us started. We've got a lot of great people giving us a lot of great information today. So I am actually going to turn this over now to Nan McMurray to talk about things as they were and maybe a little bit of where we came from in how we approach consent.
Yeah, thank you. So as Kim said, I'm really here to give a brief overview of how our current protections came into being and the ethical principles that underlie them. That is, what is informed consent intended to accomplish. And if you have ever been a PI or a member of a study team, this will be familiar territory, but we wanted to make sure that anyone attending today could start with the same background and context and as a starting point. So we could have that next slide. Okay. So the need for human subject protections was thrown into sharp relief around the middle of the 20th century with a succession of studies that are now really infamous in how abusive they were, how the mistreatment of human subjects. And this is just some of them that are listed here. We are very accustomed to criminal activities on the part of the Nazis, but I'll just mention that the next three studies happened in the United States. So it's not just a Nazi phenomenon. And just to go very briefly through them, and I'll refer back to them later, the Public Health Service study of untreated syphilis is better known as the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. And that was one in which the subjects were African-American poor sharecroppers who did not know that they were infected with syphilis, who did not know that they were being used as human subjects in a study, who were not offered effective antibiotic treatment when it became available. And this was a study that went on for 40 years, as you can see. The Willowbrook studies were conducted on children who were institutionalized and who had intellectual disabilities, who were infected deliberately with hepatitis. And the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital study was one in which, again, people who were hospitalized, institutionalized, were injected with cancer cells. So these studies strike us as particularly shocking because of their disregard for the welfare of the subjects, but we should not see them as isolated incidents or a pattern of behavior that began in the 20th century. The roots of using human subjects go back much deeper than this, to at least as far as colonial America. And they were born in a society that was characterized by profound and fundamental inequality. Inequality was embraced as a value rather than equality that is our ideal today. And so it was considered perfectly natural that some people should be on top, holding the power and giving orders to those people on the bottom who were intended by nature or by God to serve, to obey and serve. And so if you were already accustomed to holding power over family members, especially female family members or household members, or especially enslaved people, then if you expected people to grow your crops or clean your house or fix your food, it was just one small step from there if you moved into experimenting with human subjects. If you were an early scientist doing these activities, that was just one more activity that you could expect people under your power to carry out. So that may help to explain these deeper roots that may explain some of the readiness of people in the 20th century to conduct studies that tended to treat subjects as objects, to see human beings as instruments or tools or that sort of thing. So that's the troubled past of this, of what led to the development of human subject protections. So we'll look at those next in the next slide. So even as these very problematic studies were being carried out, there were already protests and efforts to improve protections for human subjects. And they came from many different sources, individuals, groups, different nations, but they coalesced in the United States really in the 1970s. And I just listed three of the kind of foundational events and documents that occurred during this time period. The National Research Act in 1974 did two things. One was to mandate the establishment of institutional review boards for research from that was funded by certain federal agencies. So that's when IRBs become a really prominent part of the landscape. And then the National Research Act also mandated the formation of a commission that was to study human subjects, research what should be the ethical framework and guidelines that underlie protections. And that was published in 1979. The commission worked for several years and came out with its final report then. And that's the long title, but it's otherwise familiarly known as the Belmont Report because of where they met, the conference center where they met. And I'll come back to those ethical principles when we get to the next slide. But along with those overarching values that the Belmont Report embodies, you also need the specific requirements and procedures to carry out those underlying ethical principles. And that's where we come to the Code of Federal Regulations, and that what's listed there, the 45 CFR 46, is where many of the protections for human subjects are are written out, and that is the title there, the regulations for the protection of human subjects, et cetera, et cetera. And the regulations and the Belmont report were sort of running on parallel tracks for a while, but then by the end of the 1970s, they were really united, and the ethical principles guiding the human subjects, the regulations. A central part of the regulations that is in one sense known as subpart A is also known as the common rule, because it was adopted somewhat miraculously by multiple federal agencies, all using it. And much more recently, starting in 2017, after about 40 years of experience with these the Belmont report and the regulations, the common rule underwent a thorough revision that was intended to draw on that experience that had revealed still some persisting weaknesses in the approach to human subjects research. So to try to provide even greater protection for human subjects, and also to accommodate and make more flexibility for newer research methods. So such things as like the internet that had come along in the intervening years, how could that play a role successfully? And also to try to reduce the administrative burden that all regulations involve, and without losing track of any of the protections for human subjects. So that is where we are now in terms of the regulatory environment. We are operating under that revised common rule, and some agencies belong to that, and some have their own sets of regulations now. But if we could go to the next slide, we will have a look at the Belmont principles and how they relate to consent. So I really like this diagram because it shows how these three big ideas are overlapping and interlocking. And just to go through them pretty quickly, the principle of justice is, in this context, it's a word we all like, but what it means here is that the selection of subjects is equitable, meaning that risks and benefits are shared out equally. So one of the many bad things about the studies I mentioned at the beginning is that one group of people was expected to bear all of the burdens and risks and harms caused by the research, but not have any access to the benefits. So that's what this is trying to establish. And also that the subject population should be selected according to the aims of the research, rather than that it might already exist as a predefined or available population. So if you, for example, were wanting to study something about incarceration, it might be appropriate to use prisoners for that as your participants. But if you are not, then there's not a good justification for using a population of people that's sort of predefined. It just happens to be there. So those are the two ideas that the principle of justice tries to enshrine. And then beneficence refers to a systematic evaluation of risks and benefits. So some of the ideas there are that risks are always reduced to the minimum necessary to accomplish the research aims. So even if the risks are minimal to begin with, you would still go through that process of trying to minimize them even further. Risks are evaluated according to the probability of harm as well as the magnitude of harm. So yesterday was a really stormy day. So if I went out walking, the probability that I would get wet, that I would be harmed by getting wet, would be very high. But the magnitude of harm I would sustain would not be very high. People don't die from getting wet. But on the other hand, if I went out walking in a storm yesterday, the likelihood that I would be struck by lightning might be fairly low, but the magnitude of the harm would be very high indeed. So those two are two axes that always have to be considered in relationship to each other. One does not trump the other or cancel out the other. Risks are also considered not only during an experiment itself, but afterwards. So the preservation and the confidentiality of the data is another source of risk that needs to be considered. Likewise, there's a calculation for benefits as well, that benefits may occur to directly to participants in the research, or they may occur more in the form of advancing knowledge. So those are ways of evaluating benefits too. And in the end, the purpose of all of this is to balance the risks and the benefits against each other. And again, that is one of the things that made those early experiments so bad. It wasn't that they had real scientific aims that could have advanced knowledge, but the risks were so extremely high for the participants, the protections were so absent that balance did not occur at all. And so we are not looking to eliminate risk entirely, but to make sure that risk is managed and that risk is balanced according to the anticipated benefits. And then respect for persons, the third of the three, is primarily achieved by upholding and supporting autonomy, the independence of every individual to make a choice, a well-informed choice about whether to participate in research or not. And this is where consent really comes into play, because that is the vehicle for making that happen. That the choice to participate needs to be completely voluntary, not subject to any kind of coercion or undue influence. And that in order to make that kind of free voluntary choice, one needs to be completely informed about what will happen in the research, about what the risks and benefits are, and that it's not just a matter of providing the information. We were talking a little bit before this session. It's not just that. It's about what the researcher can do to help the participants comprehend the information. And that can be things like the technical language, explaining that. It can be the reading level of the participants. It can be other language than the researchers are using, or it could even be the way the consent form is organized so that it makes it easier to get through and to understand. Are the important ideas at the front, and are they clearly explained? So many factors like that can go into whether people understand or not. So you might think, looking at these three principles, that consent really relates mostly to the respect for persons part, but I like to think of it as occupying that little triangle right in the center where the three principles come together. Thinking of consent as a linchpin that holds everything else together. So the research can be designed to be ethical, but if the consent is missing, then ethical research cannot be conducted. So that's why informed consent that touches on all of those values is so important. And then look from where we're going from here. I think we've made, looking at that first slide and those infamous studies, we've made enormous progress in being able to protect our human subjects. And so we certainly want to credit that effort, but we still need to look at ourselves as on an evolutionary journey rather than at a final destination point. And that we're doing very good at providing protections, but are there other things that we are perhaps not doing or not doing enough? And that's what we're hoping we'll hear about today from our other speakers. So that's it for me.
I think that was one of the most elegant portrayals of our regulation and where we've come from that I've ever heard. And I'm probably going to steal all of that for all of my outreach from now on, because that was really good. Thank you for that. All right, we're going to turn next to a pair of speakers, and Dr. Hansen and Dr. Hill are going to work together. I think Dr. Hill is going to start talking, and then they have a little discussion to have for us. So I'm really looking forward to this, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Hill.
All right, good afternoon, everybody, and extending gratitude to the Office of Research for holding space for conversation and progress and protecting consent with human subjects. It is great to be back to my graduate alma mater, although I'm not there physically, and to co-present on taking lessons on consent, such as were eloquently presented by Nan, from the classroom to being a first-time principal investigator, so in candidacy. And I'm always happy to present with my advisor extraordinaire. Did you want to say anything about yourself?
No, that's already too much.
Okay, all right. Well, Kim, with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so we're just a simple agenda today, nothing too big. We're just going to provide a little background and context for the research that I was conducting in the population that I was conducting it with. And then really integrating consent into the community engagement process throughout the research project, and not just stopping it in the beginning, but actually continually evolving the project as we're becoming more integrated into the community. And then Dr. Hansen and I are going to co-reflect on some of the key takeaways that we got from this, and hopefully contribute some things that can help move the conversation forward. Next, please. So my dissertation project was a study of the impact of relationships on the health of transgender women living with HIV. Transgender women, that's just a broad term used to describe women or people of another feminine identity who are assigned male sex at birth. Social exclusion and some of the severe economic burden that they experience. The table below is just a simple contrast between US Census data concerning poverty and unemployment among transgender people, seeing that a third of the transgender population lives at the poverty level compared to the US population. So that alone, those may experience a lot of barriers to actually accessing research, and there may be a lot of that the onus of community engagement was largely placed upon us in doing a dissertation study that sought to recruit in a diverse sample of transgender people. And so we took that into consideration, and we know dissertations are just not really set up for the whole CBPR process. That's just not how it works. It's that, you identify a literature gap, and then you have this whole, circle of advisors that help you figure out the best way to measure and conduct that study. And so I'll go a little bit more next into how we sought to really integrate the community into this process. Next, please. So the chart, the multicolored red and gray and black chart, just really shows the extensive pilot testing that we did. Again, this was an online survey. It was a national sample of transgender women living with HIV, multiply marginalized, had to really have that targeted recruitment. But we're also very concerned about making sure that our survey was culturally relevant, sensitive, and appropriate, that it was not burdensome to the participant. And a lot of these changes happened as our project was under review in IRB. We had, an outline of the content area that was kind of fixed in terms of what we were going to be asking, but how we were asking the questions and how we were assessing different technology barriers, all the way to being flexible on how we incentivize them. Given the high levels of housing instability, it's just not feasible to say that you're going to mail off incentive cards to people who have a disproportionate level of housing instability. And then also with recruitment materials, really engaging community in the process of not only pilot testing out the survey to assess those things, but also making sure that the images that we were using were inclusive and sensitive and reflected the images that they might want to see of themselves. So next. So again, all of that engagement happened largely while the project was under review. It was approved. It was submitted in September 2018. It was approved in December of that same year. And afterwards, we launched the survey. Being fairly confident that we had done all that we could, again, to increase access to the research in a way and minimize the harms in the way that our things were worded. Our questions were worded and the way the measures that were included. But there was sustained community engagement after the project launched. We began collecting data the end of January, and this was mainly through online forums, and eventually secured a partnership with a local HIV service provider with a large proportion of transgender clients. And upon doing that, was able to obtain a letter of support and resubmit that to IRB and use some of their space and their resources to observe participants taking the survey in person and provide technical assistance. One of the things that kind of came up when I was sitting there and watching people taking the survey is I wasn't completely clear if they were understanding the consent form. It seemed like I was seeing what happens to a lot of students. I'm sure a lot of anybody who's an instructor right now sees that when you're in class and you're talking and there's kind of the glazy eyes. I was seeing the glazy eyes. So I kind of started to take it upon myself to start reading it aloud as they were taking it to see if they understood it. And then again, asking, all right, do you understand that? You indicate, you hit here if you agree to participate and you select this if you do not. And, some people, it was clear that they understood, but I also saw that kind of like short nod that people do when they want you to think that they understand something, but you really know that they intuitively, that they don't understand it. So that alone signaled, that there was an immediate need to alter the consent form. I had also at that point, through Dr. Hansen, one of his former colleagues is a big service provider for transgender women living with HIV in New York. And I had that person review the materials and provide feedback on things ranging from recruitment to anything else that stuck out to them. And their primary feedback was that the consent form did not match the literacy level of people, of a majority of transgender people who may only have a middle school to an elementary school education. So that was the conclusion that we arrived at, and it was pretty much an easy decision, but it was complicated again, because we're dealing with dissertation project timelines, graduation timelines, we're dealing with funding, all these things of that nature, but it wasn't questionable in the sense of, the ability, I wanted people to be able to understand, Dr. Hansen did as well, to what they were fully participating in. And so the advice that I received from the external consultant was to look into readability formulas to downgrade the literacy level of the form, and also make some alterations to it to position things such as Nan was describing to make it easier for people to interact with the information and absorb it. If you could advance to the next slide, please. Just a top level overview, readability formulas, they do that. They measure the ease of reading a certain text or layout. There's a lot of resources that you can use. So I went to a website called readabilityformulas.com. It's a free tool that I was able to put in certain segments of the consent form. And based upon, the algorithm determined by the number of words, the sentences, the syllables, it can shoot you back a score, a continuum, which lets you know how easy or difficult it is to understand a certain form, certain text, and then also the grade level. And the grade levels typically range from elementary school to college graduate and above. And if anyone can guess, the consent form that I used was the template that was provided on IRB's website. It was a graduate level plus that it was rated. So clearly I had some work to do, all the midst of while like in panicky student mode. I do want to highlight before moving forward some limitations of these formulas so that, people don't feel the urge to just throw in a consent form and alter it to lower the score or adjust the score. Is that you do really need to engage with the community to understand their level of comprehension and engaging with transgender people. At this point, I was fully integrated with a lot of different segments of the transgender community, though I had not previously been before this project. But I knew that they were familiar with the research process in general, and that there were some terminology, some things that they did understand while it was really more so the presentation of that information. So I didn't want to run the risk of infantilize them or make them, confuse them by trying to switch up the terminology for things that they did understand. So that's something else to consider when using these readability formulas. And then also know that there's a variety. You can see in the bold black, those are just a few of the formulas that you can use. And sometimes you'll get conflicting scores. If you put your information in one formula, it'll tell you it's graduate level. If you put it in another, it might tell you it's middle school. So it's important to be educated on exactly what your formula is doing and what the score is based upon. Could you advance to the next slide, please? Just a simple overview of before and after. So I already said that it told me that the consent form was a graduate level, and I got a terrible score in terms of the ease of how, of reading it for probably even someone who is an undergraduate. But it just featured a lot of long statements and text strings. It was a lot of passive voice. And the thing that improved my score was substituting some of the larger words with plain language words, and using bullet points and breaking down the consent form into sections like about the study, and then, risk, benefits, really breaking it down and using active voice. And I was able to get a score that brought it down to an 8th grade reading level based upon that. Next, please. And this is just a little visual of what it looked like. So you can see visually, this is what it looked like before. And I'm not going to go through and read it all, but this is a lot to take in, right? When you're presented with large chunks of information, this really goes against the whole presentation and academic writing rules that we're presented with, just large blocks of information that kind of go around the point, but don't directly address it. And I'll just read the first sentence and then I'll show you the contrast. The first sentence: your involvement is voluntary, and you may choose not to participate or to stop at any time without penalty or loss of benefits to which you are otherwise entitled. Could you please click and show the after? This is the same section with the same information, but it's much more simplified and it's a lot more palatable and easy on the eyes. To reduce the burden and the barriers that, especially when we're dealing with multiply marginalized groups that already have barriers and have had negative experiences with institutions and people alike who are non-transgender or non-Black or whatever their status is. Could you advance to the next one? So just at this point, I would like to engage in an open reflection of some of the key takeaways and lessons that we got from this experience. It certainly changed my life and it affirmed my belief in just being malleable as a researcher to change. I think we know that when we propose a project that it's inevitable that things may not turn out the way that we like it to, and we have to be aware of the things, our mentality about engaging communities and engaging patient populations and human subjects in general in a way to where we're always protecting them, no matter how inconvenient, no matter how long it may take, how much effort it may take, and to advocate for that change. I will say that, after, I made that change to the consent form, IRB did hit me back and ask, why I used a different form. And I was able to clearly say that based upon observation, also external expertise, it was not matching the literacy level of the population. And I didn't get any pushback because, again, we should be working hand in hand for the same objective. So Dr. Hansen, did you have anything to comment on about just going through this process with me as a graduate student?
Well, actually, one of the things I was going to ask you if you could speak a little bit more about is just the experience of being a graduate student. And you kind of alluded to the idea that, you were on a timetable and you didn't have a whole lot of funding for this. And it did add some complications to you to actually try to go back through and do this in a way that you felt better about. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, there definitely are those anxieties with everything in graduate school. I've never been more unsure of myself in life, period. So, despite whatever I accomplished before graduate school and after, then that one phase. And I will say that the more, I had started the conversation with community, starting, before the project. And so I had become just fully immersed in the mentality that, everything in order for this to benefit not only myself, but also the transgender population that I'm dealing with, that I needed to have those changes were necessary. And I would say that a lot of them were demanding it because of the negative experiences that they've had with being tokenized by researchers, I heard a lot of people venting to me about their previous negative experiences, all the way from engagement to dissemination. So I didn't want to be on that list. And so for me, it was just something I had to do, and I couldn't worry about it because I was already in it. I had already committed to doing it. And I would say that I'm going to throw it back on you that, having a supportive advisor that made sure that, that took my voice and took my word for what it was and didn't put anything else above that, I think was really helpful. I could come to you and say, well, this is what happened. I think we should change it. And you were saying, okay.
So I actually really valued this experience working with you on this project. I'm sure that the IRB is always thrilled when they see one of my studies come in. We like to challenge the IRB with all kinds of we've done stuff with, criminalized injection drug use and sex work in Russia, and people not wanting to have any sort of information about themselves collected, or people living in violent relationships who want to use pseudonyms or don't want to sign consent forms. So we've done a lot of work around trying to understand how to approach consent in creative ways. So I really appreciated that, watching you kind of struggle through that process as well. And I don't know, I always kind of, this is one of the dirty secrets of a dissertation advisors. We like to see you, as much as we want to see you have a good study and be able to publish something, we want to see you actually stretch. And so it was kind of a really fun experience to see you take on this challenge and do a lot of it just going out and doing it, and that was really a cool experience for me. So that, I guess, thinking about the population, what kinds of, I have lots of challenges that I can think of, but do you have any challenges that really stood out to you, particularly with the online format that you were working with?
Yeah, it was very much just, working with Qualtrics and altering the structure and really tailoring it towards a mobile interface, which is like an interface that's available in a Qualtrics survey, but I don't know that researchers really pay attention to that little side pane to see how questions are presented. But knowing that my population, again, experiences high housing instability, and wanting to include them in there, it's just like I can understand how their relationships are influenced their HIV outcomes, and not, just having this highly privileged subset of transgender women living with HIV and thereby biasing my conclusions. It was really important to pay attention to that mobile interface. And I think, that was a big challenge for me. It took me about 2 months to program a network. It's a multi-level survey. So you're asking about the participant and you're asking about members of their network within a certain time. So I was very concerned about that. And then, of course, we did the analysis to see how the online participants contrasted with the ones that were in person. We found that they were significantly more likely to have health insurance, housing, to have a higher income level, and more likely to be white. And so that means that we're leaving out the populations that are in the margins, are the people that are in these community-based organizations. And so that's where I was seeing most of the issues. I did have a couple of participants call in for technical support on the phone, and I was happy to schedule a time to sit down and provide that to them. But other than that, it seemed, when I looked at the surveys, the average amount of time it took people, how many times they had to go in and out, it seemed like people were able to go in and out in 25 minutes and provide a large amount of data. And I was really satisfied with it.
One other thing that I think you did really well, and is I think really an important thing to do with this kind of work, is all of the formative work that you did. Really doing focus groups and talking to experts, that work with this population, talking to people who provide services, but most importantly, going out and really working with the population to say, hey, what do you think of this? And do you get what we're trying to do here? And how would you do it better if you could give us some feedback? So I think you took a lot of time to really get out and, and you kind of mentioned this at the beginning, that you did it with the surveys and with the phone interface and all of that. And it's kind of interesting that, in some ways, I guess we kind of took it for granted that people would be okay with consent. And we really worried more about the data collection itself. But I think it's really a credit to you that you noticed that they were having trouble with the consent, even though that they were doing all right with the data collection, because you put a lot of work into that. And you went back and fixed it. You really took the time to say, all right, we need to look at this again. And, I'm sort of going to tattle here. I remember how stressed you were with the whole idea that this is going to set me back months, having to go through IRB again to get all of this approved. But you did it anyway, even though you were really worried that does this mean I'm going to be able to graduate on effort that you did, and that you did it right. You didn't just throw it through some of these algorithms and try to scale it back, but you went back and checked with people and did a really formal process with that.
I just want to empower. Yeah, thank you for that, because you never hear these things, these conversations. But I just want to empower, graduate students especially, and researchers at all stages, to reach out, especially since we're increasingly doing this virtual research. That is the way. I just finished leading some virtual projects for CDC research in Atlanta, and that this is the way, and there are people who are accessible stakeholders. If it's not your direct participants that you might be engaging with, there are people that have those day-to-day interactions. Find those people, say, can you look over this really quick? This is what I'm working on, and get their feedback and get multiple perspectives, because people are going to have varying levels of information and different views. And, I would say to that, given the amount of formative that I did and engagement, I wouldn't have expected to have to change the consent form mid-project. But that just shows that research is just so huge that you really do need multiple eyes on multiple things.
Thank you both. That was really an interesting conversation to hear and be part of. And I have to say, I'll just add this in before I turn this over to Dr. Renzi Hammond, that from the IRB perspective, watching that same process, hearing what you were experiencing and how you were going to address that was just as fascinating. Clearly, we remembered this years later and needed to hear this and wanted everyone else to share in that as well. It was really eye-opening and informative for us as well. So I really appreciate your input there. All right, Dr. Renzi Hammond, I'm going to let you take this one.
All right. Thank you again to the Office of Research for putting all of this together. I think these are so valuable. Some of my own graduate students have been able to jump on at various intervals and have begged me to make sure that recordings are actually going to be available for them. So I'm excited about this too. So I'm going to take a slightly different spin on all of this. So my name is Lisa Renzi Hammond. I'm the vice chair of the biomedical IRB. So we tend to see studies that are a little bit more clinical in their orientation. And I'm also with Nate and formerly with Miranda in health promotion and behavior. And now I'm in the Institute of Gerontology as well. So you can sort of see based on my affiliations where mine might be heading. So let's go ahead and flip slides. Research is me search. I look at the attendees here and I can anticipate who our future attendees will be for recordings. And I know some of you, and I know some of the things that you're studying and why you're studying them. So that is my grandmother. That is Marie Renzi. And this is about 6 months before her death. She is in my house with me. That is my house in good old Watkinsville, Georgia, where my goats roam freely. And that is her. And she has participated in my research studies previously, because that's what family does, right? They sort of stick by you and say, what are you up to? And you say, actually, I can't tell you what I'm up to because you're going to try to be in it, and that might be coercive. And they say, but I actually want to be in it. And then I say, okay, but someone else is going to have to handle all of this and not me. So there's all these sorts of things to navigate, but my grandmother right around now was starting to develop signs of cognitive decline. Now, I'd love to show you a picture of my other grandmother from the same time period, but she had already passed away due to dementia. So research is me search. I am interested in problems like this because they are problems that are very near and dear to me. That's why we're actually building an Alzheimer's disease center on campus. Now, you didn't come here today to hear about my grandmother. What you came here to do was to understand how to navigate the consent process in profoundly difficult circumstances. From Nan, you got a reminder of why it's important and why we do things differently. From Miranda and Nate, you got a good understanding of how there is a lot of back and forth, a lot of iteration, and a lot of trusting your gut and saying, no, I need to do this differently. There's no template that's going to work for me. So for me, I hope that you take away what we do with individuals whose health literacy, their ability to comprehend health information and to make decisions about their health, may be compromised due to some underlying condition. So let's go ahead and flip. So I think I can say this both as a researcher and as somebody who serves on the IRB. Very often consent forms represent an interesting theory of mind problem. So we as researchers have a set of goals, right? We are known for being communicators. We communicate science. We write papers, we give presentations, we teach our classes all day long. We communicate research and its results. And our goal in doing so is to be accurate, right? We want to give the most accurate, precise information that we can so that people learn. So the most common thing that I see when I'm reviewing consent forms and, when I'm wearing my IRB hat is this problem, right? So we have researchers who are very, very well trained to communicate as concisely as possible using words that are usually very specific to their disciplines. This is what we're going to do. And then we have a second problem, which is that we have the sort of unique challenge of trying to guess what our participants know. And in Miranda and Nate's example, you can see that maybe the best idea isn't to guess, right? It's to ask. We are excellent at collecting data unless it comes to comprehension about our consent forms, in which case we don't collect any data on that, we assume. So we have a bit of a theory of mind problem, right? I mean, we don't know what our participants know, but we rarely put ourselves into their brains and try to think about what they might know and what they might do with that information. So the best way I can think of to couch the discussion that we're about to have, if we change slides, is around medicine. Everyone listening today is a patient. You have seen a healthcare provider for some reason. You are a patient, and this is what happens when you go to a doctor's appointment, right? You have to understand that something is wrong enough to schedule your appointment. Then you have to go for your pre-visit work. How many of you have gotten absolutely infuriated with intake forms because you're asked to squeeze your address onto this much space? And if you're an older person, usually in 8-point font where you can't see it. We ask you to give a cogent medical history, to describe your complaint. We ask you to manage your insurance and figure out if we're an in-network provider or an out-network provider. We ask you to tell us what's going on, and then we interrupt you within about 11 seconds, which was the latest report published pretty recently. We will interrupt our patients within 11 seconds. We try to rush you through in 7 minutes because we have lots of things we need to do during our day and lots of things we need to do to you. And the faster we can make that process, the better. We're going to give you labs. You may not understand what's going on with them, but we're going to give them to you. We're going to ask you to schedule follow-up visits with other providers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we call this the continuum of confusion. So if you click, Kim, this, and again, sorry, I don't know why those aren't synchronized. Essentially what we're doing here is battling an issue of health literacy, which is understanding, communicating, and applying health information to maximize your health outcomes. So many researchers, I think in my experience, myself included, if you think about the research study that you are conducting, how many times are you offering to give a patient health information, to use some sort of medical procedure to test them? You're bringing them into an environment where they're going to go through lots of tests and deal with lots of people who may not be speaking their language. They're going to be filling out forms, really a lot like a medical visit. And I think if I asked everybody to think about your worst medical appointment, that time that you left your appointment absolutely infuriated, how many times have you replicated that in research? So let's flip again. There's a related concept that I want us to consider, and then one more after this one. And this is the notion of health autonomy, right? The idea that you are an agent who is capable of acting in your own best interest, speaking up about what matters to you, right? That you, the sort of activated individual, can make appropriate decisions about your health. This is what we are asking you to do, essentially, when you are signing a consent form, right? We are asking you to understand what your best interests are and speak up about them. So we can click, I guess, twice, since these are no longer yoked. We are asking you to be willing to engage, right, in your own sort of health-related outcomes, recognize that they're important, and take action. You would be surprised at the number of studies that we review where essentially this is the characteristic that needs to be evoked during the informed consent process, which often is expected to happen in under 5 minutes or less. Or virtually, where we send you a consent form and you read it and you sign it and you send it back. So finally, the last piece, the gold standard, we can go ahead and click in any sort of decision about what to do about one's health is shared decision making. And in this case, right, there's a back and forth, a conversation, that your willingness to engage with a human in some sort of health-related context is based on mutual shared understanding of what the accomplishment is. Think about your consent forms where you indicate the greater benefit that you might be providing, right, to a given population, or a direct benefit that a person might receive for being in your research, right? Essentially, what you're asking a participant to do is engage in shared decision-making with you. So we can click twice. And when we do that, we're talking about collaboration. Too many times we think of the consent process as being almost dictatory. Here are the terms of our research study. You will abide by these terms. I'm giving you full disclosure. I'm going to keep your data for 10 years. I'm going to draw a gallon of your blood. I'm going to stick you in a magnet. I am going to ask you really dirty secrets. I'm going to do all of these things. But as long as I tell you it's fine and it's right here in this form and you agreed to it. In other words, we tend to think of these documents as being legalistic rather than collaborative, which brings us full circle back to the discussion and the commentary that we heard from Nan, right? I mean, what is the purpose of all of this? So let me give you an illustration. Let's go ahead and click about comprehension and how it impacts what we do. Very often in our studies, we ask people to do multiple things. Sometimes it's behavioral research where they may fill out a survey or do something like that. Sometimes we prescribe diets and we give you things that you must do before you come to your visit. And we give you complex things to do while you're at your visit. And then there's a follow-up period. And this is especially true of studies that tend to come to our board. So everyone take a look at this label. This is a fake prescription label. It's deliberately put into cartoon. And the reason it's deliberately put into cartoon is that far too often, even sometimes in our studies, when we're asking people's opinions on medical technology or the appearance of some sort of interface, we have to write in huge font fake data all over it because we don't want someone to actually think that we're telling them this is your data. And when it comes to persons with cognitive impairment, sometimes that can actually happen. So if you were to look at this bottle, you would see take 2 tablets by mouth twice daily, 2 tablets twice daily, right? That's 4 tablets that a person would need to pull out of this bottle to actually demonstrate comprehension. So go ahead and click again. Thanks, Kim. So let's look at our ability to actually follow these instructions based on sort of underlying literacy level. For persons with low literacy, if you were to ask them, how confident do you feel? Did you understand the instructions on that pill bottle? You know, about 70% of people with low literacy will say, yeah, I got that. Then when you ask for a demonstration, here's a bottle, pull out the correct number of pills for the day. We're talking about 38-ish% of people who do it correctly. If you were a doctor and you saw that, you would be really panicking about the fact that you're about to have a whole lot of medication and adherence problems that could create a serious health problem. We don't check this sort of understanding, though, in consent. We don't check to confirm before prescribing someone a diet or prescribing someone something they have to do before coming in, fasting, whatever it is, that our participants even understand the term, right? Comprehension is not checked. So let's look at marginal literacy. More people are confident that they understand how to do the task, but only about 60% do it, which means that 40% did not actually comprehend the information well enough to do the task. Now let's look at adequate. We still have a massive gap. About 20% of people were unable to pull out the correct number of pills. So what does this mean for consent? You might be thinking to yourself, this is not a medical, I'm not asking people to take a drug or do something like that, of course, unless you are, in which case this is very, very important for you. But if we think about what all of this means, this is a pretty simple appreciation of the fact that when it comes to comprehension, what we expect is that our research participants are going through this process with us, that they have enough health literacy to understand what this means, what the risks mean for their health and well-being, what the benefits might mean. We expect that they are autonomous agents who can say to us, no, this would be good for me, or actually, I'm not really sure this would be good for me at all. Who are going to engage with us, dialogue with us about the risks, the benefits, the incentives, what we're going to do and what we hope we're going to learn. But far too often it is not. So what happens when you have a person whose literacy is low? Now, we heard from Miranda and Nate some strategies that you might take. In my neck of the woods in cognition and cognitive decline, right? How do we know that a research participant has sufficient health literacy and autonomy to engage in shared decision-making with us in that consent form? So in this case, exactly as you heard from Miranda and Nate, the name of the game is creativity, right? How do you actually negotiate this problem? So I'll tell you how we do it. One strategy that we've employed is sort of using the teach-back methodology, exactly as you would expect to be done in a healthcare visit, except that our goal is to do it correctly. So often when someone engages in teach-back, what you hear, in fact, we did a recent study of medical residents who were trying to use the teach-back method and sort of looked at how it turned out. And it often can become, I loved that the word you used, Miranda, infantilizing, right? It can become very, very pedantic. Instead of owning a person's comprehension, right? What we say is, you'll hear people say, oh, I want to see if you understood that, right? I'm going to put the onus of comprehension entirely on you. I want to know if you got what I was saying. When in reality, I'm going to propose to all of you that you flip that in your head. Instead of, I want to know what you understood, I want to know if I explained that well to you. I want to know if I did a good job at telling you this, right? So it's a matter of dividing up your consent form into those discrete parts, exactly as Miranda suggested, and then asking after each part the question, I'd like to make sure that I covered everything in this. It's so important that, that you're able to make this decision. Can you tell me what you remember me saying about blank? And then if they can't, it becomes oh, you know what? I think I must have totally missed the ball on that. Let me try again, right? It's taking someone's problem and sort of owning the comprehensibility of your document and your process yourself, right? We very often place the onus on others. You must understand me instead of I must communicate better with you. Right, so that's one strategy, and for us, we essentially use the teach-back method at individual points, and at the end of our consent process, we make sure that everything is very clear. And then, honestly, for us, if it's a study that goes 6 months or longer, we do it again in the middle of our studies, right? Because cognitive status changes over time. So we stop and we do it again, and we make sure that our patients are still, able to come with us and complete the study. And sometimes they aren't. And in those cases, it becomes a matter of assent rather than consent. So it's a matter of not thinking about your consent process as being a one-time thing where you do it at the beginning and then you're good for the duration of your study, right? Consent is not one time. Consent is every visit. And it's not a matter of re-signing a consent form every visit. It's a matter of checking in and saying, hey, thanks for coming back. Just wanted to make sure that everything's still okay, that you still want to join us. We'll ask you, again, in more detail, at this time, right? It's a constant check-in and back and forth, because that autonomy, that agency that we're after, we want that to be long-lasting and we want to inspire it. So let's flip one last time and couch our discussion, about, sort of summarize some of the things that we've heard today. And the first step would be in creating a robust consent process. Think of it as a process, not a form, right? And really reflect on that theory of mind problem. I think as researchers, the onus is on us to make sure that we are constantly sort of doing a gut check and saying, is this a good idea, right? What might they know about this? What might they want to know about this? What would I want to know about this if I were in this position? What would make me feel compelled to do this study? And am I making sure that I'm putting the brakes on sort of highlighting those things? Secondly, if we click again, collect data from your participant, but not in the way that you might be thinking. Collect data about their comprehension, about their understanding, about what they see as beneficial and what they don't see as beneficial, so that you are clear about whether or not your process is working. It's a process, not an event, right? So, as you are going through the consent process, collect data, right? Figure out, did I explain this effectively? Is this worded funny, right? So my participants keep missing this part about benefit. How can I make that clearer? It's a matter of owning that problem yourself and collecting data to see how effectively your ownership is going. It is about, let's click again, changing your process if you need to. I thought that Miranda and Nate explained that so beautifully, right? Things aren't working, time to change my process and figure out how to do this differently. Click again and we will test our process, right? One thing that we do, it's sort of like if you're running a survey, you often pilot your survey before you run it. You find out how long it is. You find out if there are parts that are sort of unclear. We have a small group of folks at our institute who are living with cognitive impairment and very much want to be part of the process of engaging in research. So sometimes we send them a consent form and say, did this make sense to you? did we write this correctly? And we have a test group of folks who are always willing to read our materials and make sure they make sense. But it took a bit of time and trust to build that cohort up. All right, and next bullet, codifying your process is very important. You should be able to explain how you deal with consent, what your philosophies of consent are. They should exist, right? Why you do what you do, and you should be able to train anybody in your research community who wants to do the same thing. So, when you codify a process like this, it's a matter of creating something that is robust and enduring, that can be passed on from person to person in your laboratory. And then finally, thinking about time, complexity, things like that. A lot of researchers will say, well, I don't want to have to bring someone back for multiple visits, or I want to make sure they're only here for 2 hours and I have an hour and 50 minutes of things to do. So consent is a 10-minute window. Really thinking about the more you're doing and the more time a participant's going to be spending with you, actually the more time their consent process should take, not less. Right? We think about these sometimes almost medically, like, well, I have 57 minutes to spend with someone. I can only have them in the parking space for an hour. Therefore, consent is 3 minutes. And the answer is probably better book another hour. So I will leave it there. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for that. First, I want to say thank you to everyone for the information here today. And while I usually do a small wrap up, and yes, we want to take any questions should there be any, so nobody feel like you have to leave right now. I do want to give Nan McMurray one more chance to kind of give us a little wrap back to the IRB world and the regulation world after we've heard these wonderful stories.
Yeah. I think I'm seeing these points of tension that maybe I've never really fully understood before, where in order to do consent in the way it ought to be done, it needs to be this iterative, ongoing, flexible, developmental, evolutionary process. And yet we want your consent form and your recruitment documents set in stone when you submit your application. And if you want to change them, you have to do a modification. And those are things that we do, again, to keep people from just, running amok and making changes right and left that might have a harmful effect. But it tends to stifle the process of creativity. And so I'm thinking, what can we on the IRB do? And another example would be, researchers are busy and sometimes they're inexperienced and they want templates. What is they want to include all of the information that a consent form should have, They want templates to follow. They don't want to have to reinvent the wheel. And yet, as soon as you do that, you've kind of made a consent document an end in itself, and again, not reflective of what you could gain from your participants. And just one other thing, I'm a historian of medicine by training, and so I'm very, very interested in pre-modern medicine, that time that seems so foreign and barbaric to us today. And I know my students have the experience of assuming that because the people we study do not have the same knowledge that we have today, that therefore there's a big empty spot in their heads where our knowledge would be. And I think sometimes as researchers, we do that too. But even people with limited literacy or cognitive issues, they have active minds, and they are not just, sort of empty vessels to pour in all the information that you have to communicate about your research. It's going to be a two-way street and a very active thing, and that's what we need to be taking advantage of. And I don't need to be preaching to this choir, but I'm just reacting to what I've heard. So that'll do it.
All right, thank you so much. It's been a great series. I think this was a great one to wrap up the series. Mike, do we have any questions? I know we've already run over time, and so maybe even people that had questions might have had to shuffle out, but I think this was a great session.
And no questions yet, Kim. I'm waiting for some to come in from our attendees.
It very well could be that the end of the semester has gotten everyone really tired. I have a feeling, though, that what we've done here today and what's going to be useful for people moving forward is that they hear this, they're going to start that conversation. We're going to get the opportunity to have more conversation, even if it isn't right here at the end of this session. We're hoping next semester to take this to the next level and really start diving into diversity and inclusion and health disparities and what research should really be doing about that. Looking forward to it. I'm not sure how I'm going to pull it together yet, but hey, we'll get there. So I think that's really all I wanted to say. Anything yet, Mike, before we go?
We do have one question that has come in from Corrine Jean. Thank you, Corrine. Amazing presentations. Could you all talk a little bit more about continued engagement in the community and ways to build trust?
So Corinne, I might start with that because I know that you work specifically with older persons and, and folks like this. And I can tell you that there has been a barrier that we have faced in, in this community in particular, when we are working with older persons, that has been that we have not given, as a small pool of researchers who work in this area, that we have not actually given back enough to our community. So we work with local organizations and we say, can we please recruit your participants, the people you serve as participants, and then we never follow back up. We don't tell them how the studies went. It's not only do we not tell the organization how the studies went, but we don't even do a good job of telling the individuals who participated in the study how the studies went. So over time, one problem that we've faced in the aging research community is simply that a lot of community organizations have said, yeah, fun, great, we don't want to work with you. This is a one-way street. You are, quote, using our population for data and you're not giving anything back. So one strategy, I think, to promote community engagement is never to go in with an ask, right? It's to go in as a volunteer and to try to figure out what are the, if I'm going to work with a community organization, right? I don't want to be at cross purposes. We are all doing something, we are all trying our best to serve a specific constituency, right? So, so for Miranda and Nate, in your studies, it was, trans women. There's someone that you're interested in studying, right? Because you believe that studying that population is beneficial. You want to do something for them. You want to understand a problem, but you also want to be useful. You want to help. For those of us who study older persons, for example, it's because we're research is research, right? It's not only just our family, it's that we are sick of seeing ageism and these sorts of things happening in our communities. We want to help. So the idea that we could be at cross purposes is really sad. And it's a legacy of past research where we take and we don't give. So step one, if you want to work with a community organization, is don't go in as a researcher, right? Go in as a volunteer. Start working with these communities and building relationships organically, seeing what the constituents that they serve actually need, right? It will also inform your research. You will do much better research in the future if you have some concept of what's going on with the constituency you're trying to serve. So step one is go in with a volunteer's heart, go in and really see what they need. Spend some time getting to know the organization. Then, I have found that I have been designing programs and studies along with my organization, right? Not at them. So changing the preposition that you use, I working with a group and trying to actually do research that meets both goals. And then to me, the final piece is always follow up. They should know. Preparing a report for any community agency that you work with is important. In our case, when it's, say, Athens Community Council on Aging, we not only prepare a report, we go in, we present it, we form advisory boards, and we ask their stakeholders what they would like us to do about, the things that we're finding. So it's really going at these things with, always keeping in mind that sort of beneficence issue. What are you doing that is not only not harmful, but eventually good for the community that you're serving?
You can ask Miranda how many meals she's served.
Yeah, I mean, Lisa, you said it way better than I could have said, but that's exactly what I did. And as a pre-doc, I believe it was the summer, I hadn't even identified my target population, but I knew that I wanted to work with people living with HIV and do help HIV services research. And so I tried to volunteer with the largest HIV provider in Metro Atlanta. And it was hard to get in there. It took time, but eventually I got in, and I would just go to their community advisory board meetings. Like, a lot of times, if you're, a healthcare focused or CBO focused, they're going to have meetings that are open to the community. And there's multiple. Once I went into there, I learned about all the other community advisory and provider consortiums that are within the area. And I just sat there and I observed, and I offered to help wherever they needed to. But I was a student, I was busy, and I was clear in communicating that I couldn't come to every meeting. And I think that sometimes people think it's all or nothing mentality. But when you go to these, you find that there's no researchers that are sitting in there that, you're the student that's sitting in there. Eventually, I did end up doing a service project for them, like a resource guide. But I would even impel, administrators within educators, like, use your students and your mentees to do service oriented projects with these agencies, thereby reducing the burden of you actually having to do it, but increasing their learning and building their capacity as an organization and community as well. That was something that I was doing as a student. And keeping in mind that social exchange theory, I think that's what Lisa was talking about, that idea that these relations should be symbiotic, that wanting something should also be accommodated when wanting to give something back. And so in the transgender organization that I formed a partnership during data collection, it was about me calling, reaching out and trying to find somebody. And then when I sat down and had that conversation, I had that mindset that what is it that you need? And yes, a lot of times it is data. It is data that they want to use to apply for grants. How can I use this to support your support programs and things of that nature? And what else would you like me to do for you with this research? And so, although I didn't devise it with their needs in mind in the beginning, you can still figure out a way, because again, that is the broader purpose or the broader focus of a lot of our projects. And so that's the way that I did it. In terms of dissemination, I think the most stressful thing, I don't know if you remember this, Nathan, was that I defended on a Tuesday and I disseminated to a symposium that Friday. And so I did the biggest presentation of my life with this dissertation data. And then I had to code switch it to a community provider language, for a big symposium that was being put on by the same agency. And it was just something I had to do. I just had to eat it and say, okay, this is a part of the deal. This is and they were so thankful for it. But I could say that my mind was just trash after that. I slept for weeks.
Amanda, your mind has never been trash.
It was done. It was done.
Yeah, I think
So,
to follow up on that point too, I love that you mentioned grant writing. I actually do now grant write with my community partners completely and utterly. It benefits us both immensely, but sometimes also you just need a gatekeeper, right? I mean, if you're not finding entrance into the organizations that you want to work with, reach out, right? There might be somebody out there who does, and it might take just a little bit of, of investigating to figure out who that might be. But very often with, other researchers who are already working in this context would be happy to introduce you. It's just a matter of making sure that you and those researchers have an understanding that that things are going to be done a certain way at that organization, right? That, if you are going to work there, you are committing, if you're gonna recruit that population, via a gatekeeper, you are going to commit to the following and actually sort of executing it, because some of these relationships are very, very hard earned, and sometimes you're undoing someone else's mistakes from the past when you're trying to break into that community. So it's a really important thing to remember.
and take them to lunch. That's what I did with my gatekeepers. I just, I found that person, and it was again through the community advisory board years ago. They had seen me there, and I didn't know that I was going to be researching trans women, but this person happened to be a really huge gatekeeper. And I was able, at the time when it came for me to do research, and I was thinking about it, said, hey, can we go out for lunch and talk more? So diplomacy goes a long way in these things.
Great. Thanks to all of you for those great responses. Any last questions before our panelists, before we wrap up today? Okay, well, seeing none, let me say thank you again to our panelists and to everyone who joined us today. If you need to refer back to it, the video recording will be posted to the Research Matters Live website in just a couple days. Also, this is the final Research Matters Live scheduled for spring semester. We thank you again for being with us today, as well as for any previous sessions you attended. We might see some more events pop up this summer. I'm not sure, but if we do, we will do our best to let you know. And again, please feel free to check back at the Research Matters Live website to find out more info. So on behalf of the Office of Research, may the 4th be with you, and everyone have a great summer. Bye-bye.